Back when I was in elementary school, there used to be a very popular book amongst my peers. And that book, it was Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. It's this survival book about a guy in a forest, and all he has is a hatchet. Very famous book by Gary Paulsen. Unfortunately, Gary Paulsen passed away in, I believe, 2021. And the last book he published is called Northwind, which is what we're going to be talking about today here on the Minecraft Book Club, while I continue layering the snow down in our western city. And like always with my fiction books, I'm going to give a quick summary of the book, and this will include spoilers, so if you plan on reading Northwind, I'd recommend clicking off the video if you're afraid of spoilers, although there isn't really anything to spoil in the book. This book is a lot more about the journey than the destination. So let's get started with that summary. The book starts off with sort of a poem talking about this little orphan boy named Leif. Leif's mom died during childbirth, and Leif's dad, I think, died in battle and is now in Valhalla. And so Leif is this little orphan Viking boy. Because he's an orphan, he's kind of unloved by everyone, and he's used as manual labor for this boat. And one day, while the boat is in port, some Russians come in and they're really diseased, and they end up bringing cholera to the town he's in. And since this is a much older time, everyone starts dying because cholera is pretty dangerous. It basically just causes a ton of vomiting and diarrhea. So one of the adults in Leif's life, which is called Old Carl, he tells Leif and his son Little Carl to go escape and get in this canoe and just sail north. So that's exactly what Leif and Little Carl do, is they get in this canoe and they head north to avoid all of the disease in the town. However, as they're leaving, both of them get really sick, and Little Carl dies, like in the first chapter. So then it's just Leif, and he gets really sick. Leif finally comes kind of to consciousness and realizes that Little Carl is dead, and he finds an island to go and bury Little Carl on. So he finds an island, buries Little Carl, and then slowly over the next couple of days he recovers his health. He ends up going a little towards the mainland and finding some berries, and as he's picking the berries, a bear shows up, but he kind of just stands still and the bear ignores him. He then hunts some salmon with a spear that he brought with him on the canoe, and after he finds a salmon and hunts it, he decides that it's probably smart to move to an island off of the coast so that when he cooks the salmon, it doesn't attract more bears. So he goes away and cooks up the salmon, and then he eats it, and he slowly recovers over the next few days. This cycle continues over the next few chapters. It's basically just Leif out on the ocean in his canoe, and every now and then he heads back to the mainland to hunt some salmon and gather some berries. I think the only notable thing from this segment is that there's a couple orcas that play around with his canoe, but they're not really violent, they just like playing with it. And he also ends up in a fjord or like a bay area, and while some orcas are playing around with his canoe, they end up finding a bunch of salmon that he was gonna hunt, and these orcas go and round up all the salmon and whip their tails really fast to sort of boil the salmon. I think it's something about there's so many bubbles in the water that the salmon can't swim properly, so they all float up to the top, and all the orcas take turns fishing for the salmon and getting their fix. But one day while he's out on ocean, he's asleep in his canoe, and unbeknownst to him, his canoe goes straight into a whirlpool. Uh-oh. And he gets sucked down into the whirlpool, and his canoe almost sinks, but it's made of wood, so he ends up floating, and he kind of crashes onto an island. He's lost a bunch of salmon that he smoked over the past few days or weeks or however much time has passed. He also loses an oar from his canoe and the spear he was using, but that's no big deal because he has a second oar and he just uses wooden spears instead of the metal one he had. As he's recovering from this loss, he goes on to the mainland again to go catch some salmon. And while he's catching the salmon, a brown bear shows up. All the bears he has been encountering have been black bears, so a brown bear is pretty scary to him. But he finds that after just leaving the bear alone, he's in no harm. He also restarts kind of a journal. He was doing this and I just didn't talk about it, but he had this like piece of wood that he was carving stories into, and it was basically just hieroglyphs. He drew a picture of a bear and a picture of an orca. I forgot to mention this kid's like 12. But now he decided that he's going to write more proper stories, and he basically writes like a poem or something, I guess. I don't know. It's more story-like instead of just a couple pictures. So he continues canoeing north, and the further north he goes, the worse the waves get. And the waves now are pretty aggressive out in the ocean. At one point, he's pretty scared he's going to crash into a rock or something, but there's a bunch of dolphins that he's been following. So he looks at the dolphins and he matches what the dolphins are doing in the ocean with their like positioning and what they do when big waves come. So by copying the dolphins, he ends up making it out of there alive. And then a few days later, there's a ton of fog and a bunch of crashing noises. And once he gets out of the fog, he finds that he's surrounded by a ton of whales that are breaching the water. And he's really scared because a couple of them are breaching right next to where his canoe is, and he thinks he's gonna capsize, but he doesn't, and he kinda just appreciates seeing all the whales. According to Leif, this teaches him the lesson that you either live or die, but in between you learn. Honestly, not too sure how he came to that lesson. I don't think he really learned anything in that scenario, but it's whatever. Kid is 12. Anyway, he continues sailing north, and all of a sudden there's these massive blue boats everywhere. And Leif is like, what? Humans? I hate humans. But his curiosity gets to the best of him, and he sails close to these blue ships. But aha, they're not blue ships, they're actually just massive icebergs that are blue, because they are blue ice. And I actually found out that blue ice is a real thing through this book. It's basically ice that just keeps getting compressed or something, and it just turns blue. So to me, that's more of a learning thing than watching whales, but I don't know. After that, he decides to go back towards the mainland just because the water is getting pretty nasty. Very aggressive waves. And once he gets to the mainland, he ends up in this like fjord. Since he's been sailing so much, he learns that a couple areas in the fjord are going to have really aggressive waters. So he's learned to avoid those and kind of just circle around them. While he's parked in this fjord, he kind of watches the wildlife, and he gets a little scared because he's like, wow, these are all such dangerous animals. But then he thinks about it for a second, and he's like, well, I was kind of abused as an orphan, so anything that is dangerous out here is probably just as dangerous as any human could be. So he kind of comes to peace with the idea that he'd rather be surrounded by dangerous animals than dangerous humans. He doesn't really explain why, though. He keeps writing on this little storyboard that he has, just carving in more stories, and he realizes that he can probably try and bring it into his dreams. So every night before he sleeps, he stares at the board and goes to sleep. And the point of this is he keeps having a recurring dream of his mother who died during his childbirth, and he can never see her face. So his idea is that he's going to try and bring the storyboard into his dream, and that way he can see his mom's face. Genuinely no idea how that would work, but it is some little Norse orphan kid that hasn't talked with anyone in like months. Now, obviously, this does not end up working for him. He never gets to see his mom's face. But he does meet a whale that he thinks is his mom's spirit, because it just keeps following him. And the book ends, what I'd say is rather abruptly. He ends up just sailing more north, and he finds sort of a piece of debris in the water, and it's this spruce oar, or like a boat paddle. And the kid sees this, and he's like, uh-oh, there's humans to the north. I better go south. And that is how the book ends. Psych! The book ends with an author's note that is actually kind of important to the story, and that is because the author sort of explains that Leif's story is his own story. You see, Gary Paulsen grew up in a Norwegian family, and his grandma would always tell stories about like the Vikings and just old folk tales in general. So he grew up always thinking that he had a connection to the ocean. He also grew up near the Pacific Northwest, which is like Washington and Oregon, and he got really into sailing later in his life, and so he sailed a ton in that area, as well as just like the Pacific Ocean in general. He was talking about sailing from like California to Hawaii in a sailboat, which I could never. But he talks about how while it was fun to sail with others, it was really just fun to sail by himself sometimes. And he also talked about how it was fun to, deal with all the nature and stuff up in the north, because there's a lot of dangerous animals and dangerous waters, but he kind of feels satisfied because he got to conquer all of them, I guess. But then he finally explains the setting of the book, and the setting is a mystical frontier that is based off of the Pacific Northwest and then the North Sea in Europe, which makes a lot more sense because I've never heard of orcas being a big part of anything other than like Washington and Alaska. And it sounds like that's the general consensus online, is that people were pretty confused with the setting. But yeah, that is the summary of the book. And if you're wondering why it didn't really sound very detailed or anything like that, it is because this book is a book for middle grade. So that's like middle school students, which would be like, I think like 11 to 14-year-olds. So it's not going to be that complex of a book. But I'm of the opinion that every book exists to make an argument, or at least of some sort, right? You're trying to tell a story that has a lesson. So my question is, what is the lesson here in this book? I have come up with 4 different lessons that could be the lesson for this book. None of them conflict with each other, but I am going to go through each of them separately. But there's definitely a lesson here in this book, especially if it's targeted for children. My opinion is that if a book doesn't have a lesson, it has no reason to exist. Because books should teach you at least something, I think. I'm going to start by talking about my first idea, and I think this is the correct one out of the 4. But the idea here is that nature is solitude. Leif never talks in this book at all. That's a lie. He says like, ugh, or something like that. But this book is like 99% exposition. There's like no dialogue. So we don't get much in characterization from Leif. However, the one bit of character we do get from Leif is that he hates people. He hates all the people except for little Carl, old Carl, and his mom. Everyone else, though, he would like to avoid. So that's why I think that this book is arguing for the idea that nature is solitude. If you're out in the wild, you don't have to deal with humans that you don't like, so it's very tranquil, right? There's a lot of people, in fact, I'd say most people, can find solitude in nature. I remember as a kid really enjoying camping just because it was so quiet, right? And all you had around you was just trees where you could just go out and explore, and there was basically no rules except for, don't catch the forest on fire. And it was fun to just sit there and watch animals. Used to watch chipmunks a ton. But there's something calming about just sitting there and observing nature go. And that's what Leif does for most of the book. He watches the whales, he watches the salmon. To avoid the bears, he just watches them. There's a lot of watching. This guy would love the hobby of bird watching. He gets to do that a bit in the book, but it's only with ravens. But I'm sure if he were in a more interesting setting where there were more than just ravens and whatever other bird there was another bird, I think an eagle, he'd probably have a blast. My point here is that there's so many instances throughout the book of Leif becoming peaceful and tranquil just by observing nature that it would be weird to argue that that's not part of the argument of the book, is that we find peace in nature. Despite everything that's violent, nature is beautiful and tranquil. And I guess that sort of leads in nicely to my next idea, which is that human violence is not preferable to the raw violence of nature. I don't have much to talk about here other than just Leif saying it himself. He's all like, oh, I'm scared of all these animals, but, humans are kind of scary too. This is actually something that's been happening in pop culture a bit. I know there was some TikTok trend about asking people if they'd rather be in a forest with a random man or a bear, and like everyone was saying a bear. But this kind of ties into that point where the dangerous things a human could do are not as bad as the dangerous things that could happen. Human violence is just something different compared to just getting mauled by a bear. You can just stare at a bear, apparently, and they'll leave you alone. So I don't know, that's really all I have to say on that point. There's not much to that argument. Like I said, I think my first idea is my strongest and probably most accurate. But who knows, maybe there's a hole in that argument, so I'm just making like 4 arguments. My third idea is that hunger is the driving force of everything. And I guess I didn't really talk about it much in the summary, but Leif is hungry through most of the book. and that drives a lot of his actions, such as risking his life in front of a bear because he's hunting salmon and he needs the food. In fact, at one point, I think Leif blatantly says that that is an argument he's making. This is when he's watching the orcas that are peaceful and just playing with him and having fun all of a sudden become really violent because they're hunting the salmon. So I guess the idea would be that nature is beautiful, but hunger is the driving force and is the champion of all. However, it appears that this project is the champion of me because I am out of snow again. We're so close to finishing this though. My body hungers for more snow. Just kidding, my body hungers to be done with this project. I'm just sick and tired of mining snow. So many dang shovels go into this project, it's insane. I will say, this area is looking pretty good. This was kind of a hard choice to make, but as they say, the hardest choices require the strongest wills. And where there's a will, there's a way. That is what I have learned from playing a lot of Minecraft. But that is also maybe what I've learned from this book, is that learning is essential to your survival. I actually didn't come up with this idea for what the lesson here in the book is. This is actually the author's idea. What I failed to mention in the author's note is that he already said basically what the argument of the story is, and that is that if you are willing to learn, you can survive. He blatantly says that in the author note, so I know it is the supposed real argument of the book. I don't think it's that strong of an argument given the story, but we're gonna try and describe it here. So I guess throughout the entire story, we follow Leif learning how to use his canoe in the ocean, right? There's a ton of moments where he's gonna capsize because of whales or dolphins or high waves, and he ends up not doing those things because he's learned how to control his canoe. If instead of being willing to learn, Leif had just been scared and frightened the whole time, he would have died. But instead, he found the courage to learn about a situation and try to make it better. He ends up following the swimming patterns of the dolphins to try and stabilize himself in the ocean. He learns not to capsize in fjords where the currents are strong in the exits because they're bottlenecks for the ocean. Through his methods of learning, he's able to find a way to survive. That is what Gary Paulsen says the argument to the book is, but honestly, I think my first idea was a bit stronger. And who knows, those could both be arguments in the book. There's not one says-all be-all for what the argument of a book is. Books are kind of like art in that sense. The author can have an intention when they originally write the book, but if you look at a book and you gain a specific lesson from it that wasn't intended by the author, that's not to say that that lesson is incorrect. It's just something that you specifically get that no one else does, maybe. As they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And this is true in all areas of life. Throughout my time in high school, we had to read a bunch of books in my English class. And there's one book in particular that everyone says is such a great book, but I honestly hate. And that is The Great Gatsby. I dislike this book with an immense passion because I gain nothing from the book. However, one of my close friends loves the book. It's his favorite book in the world, The Great Gatsby. I gain nothing when I read The Great Gatsby. I think it's a very average book, and I don't understand why people put it on such a pedestal. But when he talks about it, I can see that he's really passionate about the book, and there's something in it that he found that I cannot see. And perhaps that sense of learning that you get from the book isn't visible to me, or maybe even you, because we are adults, and this book was made for middle grade students. It's like those annoying movie essay people online that go and watch a kid's movie and talk about how it was like a horribly written movie. And then like the movie's the Garfield movie or something. And you're like, you are not the target audience for the Garfield movie, my friend. I know of 0 people that went into the Garfield movie expecting some grand thematic overhaul of their life. Some grand lesson to gain from the Garfield movie. Like it's a kid's movie for a reason. And perhaps that's why I don't understand this argument of the book being about learning, because it's not meant for me. It's meant for little kids with a sense of adventure that perhaps I have lost. So with all that being said, I'm going to leave this episode off with just my own rating of the book. I would say that this book is very average. I don't think there's anything special about it. But like I said, if you find something special about it, that's totally up to you, right? I will definitely not be reading many more middle grade books for this series, but it's always good to get a little bit out of your comfort zone sometimes. I'm out of snow. But yeah, middle grade survival books is definitely out of my comfort zone. Or not really comfort zone, it's just out of the ordinary for me. My go-to books typically are either historical fiction, historical nonfiction, or fantasy. So very different from the book we read today, or really any of the books I've been reading on the channel. We'll eventually get to some historical nonfiction and historical fiction and stuff later. But you might be wondering why I even chose to read this book today. And to be honest, I would have never picked this book. I was in a book club while in college. At the end of every semester, there was a book exchange where people would bring books that they didn't want anymore, and they would basically just describe what the book's about, and then people would fight over it. Well, the person that brought this book to the book exchange, they basically said that they could not get through any of the pages of this book because it was not their kind of book, and nobody was fighting over taking this book. So I was like, you know what, I'll take it. I'll give it a go. And I've had it sitting on my bookshelf for a while, but I finally read the book because they said it was pretty unreadable. And look at me, I've read it. But we definitely have some cool books coming up on the channel in the future. I've got another nonfiction, I think sorta self-help book coming up on the next episode. And then I think we're going to dive into some historical fiction, specifically westerns, because, you know, we're in a western town. So you guys can look for that here in the future. Also, thank you guys for watching the last episode. Honestly, when I was recording it, I thought it was going to be a complete and utter flop. But it is now my most successful video that I've ever done, which I was not expecting. So if you're new to the channel, welcome in. Glad to have you here. Hopefully I talk about some books that you like, and if not, I hope you learn something new. And in case you missed it, I have now joined Autocraft, which is a SMP, and that'll be a bi-weekly series, so every other week I intend to post on that. Whoa! What up, guy? Oh my gosh, actually, I need that. Hold on. There he is. Come on, come on, come on. Gimme Helmas. Thank you. Beautiful. Haha, wonderful, man. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, we're so close. And just like that, we are done. This project is complete. We have snow everywhere. It's nice and beautiful, really beautiful. And now looking in this direction, I can basically say that every block you see is a block that I placed. But anyways, guys, thank you all for watching today's episode. I hope you learned something new, and have a wonderful day.